by that point, everyone knows that the Tudor dynasty is over. He has to watch his son slip away from him. It's a real tragedy. The Tudors were very much dependent on the Dudleys, the women stepping in to essentially clean up the mess and to ensure the family's survival and position. I thought the story was beautiful and compelling. I cried as I was writing it more than once.
Welcome to the British History Channel and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, hi, and I hope you enjoyed the interview. And also, if you do, look back, we have hundreds of videos which may be of interest. So today I am talking to Dr. Joanne Paul. Now, over the summer, I read Joanne's book called The House of Dudley. And if any of you have been watching any of my live streams, you'll know that I've been raving about it ever since. It follows the heady heights of power that the Dudleys got to, followed by the depths of being branded traitors and indeed being executed as traitors, and that sort of undulating cycle that the family went through. So I am very excited to be talking to Joanne today. Joanne is a writer, historian and broadcaster working on the history of Renaissance, Tudor and early modern periods. She is honorary senior lecturer at the University of Sussex and a BBC AHRC New Generation thinker. She has published with the Cambridge University Press Ideas in Context series and has been widely praised for her work on Thomas More, William Shakespeare, Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. Now, The House of Dudley is her acclaimed history of the Dudley family. It's been picked as a Times Book of the Week and Book of 2022. It's also #1 on Amazon as we speak. The House of Dudley also garnered excellent reviews in The Telegraph, The Sunday Times, Mail on Sunday, Literary Review, Spectator, and was featured in History Today and BBC History Magazine. Now, I was fortunate enough to hear Joanne talk at the Warwick Words Festival earlier this autumn in the beautiful surroundings of St Mary's Church, Warwick, only feet away from the Beauchamp Chapel, where Robert Dudley, his wife Lettice Knowles, and his brother Ambrose Dudley are all buried. Now, as usual, members of the British History Patreon Club have submitted their own questions, which I will put to Joanne at the end of the interview. That makes up the extended ad-free interview that all patrons get access to. Now, if you're not a patron and you'd like to be, there are plenty of other benefits as well. Please go to www.patreon.com/British History to have a look what you can get, and it's only £5 a month. Cancel anytime you like. Joanne, I've thoroughly enjoyed your book. I started reading it over the summer, so I've been very excited about you joining me today to chat about it. So first of all, welcome, thank you, and I've given a brief introduction to you already, but could you, in your own words, tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about your work, please?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. We've met in person as well, which is a fantastic treat. So it's really nice to be on your podcast. Yeah, I am a historian of the Renaissance and early modern periods, particularly in England, which means the Tudors, and a smidge of the Stuarts every once in a while. I particularly focus on cultural history, political history, what's called intellectual history, so history of ideas, and House of Dudley is my first trade book.
And you've done very well, and we will clearly get onto that. In fact, I think as we speak, isn't it #1 in its category, but like it's quite a broad category on Amazon?
Yeah. I'm very pleased to say over the weekend it hit the #1 spot. So yeah, very, very exciting. A #1 spot. I think it's Tudor and Stuart history, which is thrilling.
Which are big categories. I mean, there's lots of competition in those categories.
Yeah, it's been selling very well, which is so exciting as a writer, because I spent 5 years working on this, and so 5 years it was just mine. And I was really, really excited to get to share everything that I found, the stories that I encountered with everyone, and to now know that it's out there and that it's out there in a really big way, there's no feeling like it in the world, really.
It must be extraordinarily satisfying that people are finding it as interesting as you did. I'm sure it feels a bit risky.
Yeah, it's a huge risk writing a book, no matter what. And I think particularly, obviously, the Tudors is a well-mined field. There have been a lot of books written on the Tudors, and to write a book from a different perspective on the Tudors, I didn't know. I didn't know if people were going to respond to that or not. I thought the story was beautiful and compelling. I cried as I was writing it more than once, because it was just so touching. But I didn't know if other people were going to find the same. And so to know, I have heard from people who have found it very emotional, who've also found it hilarious. There are a few funny bits in there as well. And so they're essentially taking the same journey reading it that I did writing it. And so, yeah, I think satisfying is definitely a good way of describing how that feels.
Yeah, it is great, because you would think, with the Tudor field being so full of books, that there wasn't, as someone who doesn't write books, was there any new perspective that could be had? And I found actually your book, and also Estelle Prank's book, Blood, Fire and Gold. I had Estelle on recently. It's a new look into something we think is familiar, but from a different point of view. It's like looking into a really familiar room, but from a different window or something. And plus, of course, the actual stories that, like you say, you've uncovered and that were generally less talked about. So we're going to hopefully cover some of those today without this going on for too long, because I know you're very busy. But and we'll get into the specifics of those things soon. But one of the things that really struck me when I finished the book was how the Dudley family's fortunes parallel the Tudors whom they served. Do you think that's a fair sort of the end thought that I had? Would you agree?
Absolutely. It was one of the thoughts that struck me as I finished as well, that there's a sense in which not only are they paralleled, but I talk about them intertwining, that they're paralleled because they intertwine, that the rise and fall together makes sense, because the Tudors were very much dependent on the Dudleys for their own survival and fortunes. We only really see, I think, the safe transition of power, and thus the establishment of the Tudor dynasty from Henry VII to Henry VIII, because of the work that Edmund Dudley and others do to fill the coffers and ensure that Henry VIII has that money to establish his reign in such magnificence. Without that, we wouldn't have the Henry VIII that we think of today as that sort of golden prince who loves tournaments and is able to go to war with France, for instance. And then they end almost together as well, and for the same reasons, that inability to produce an heir, which is precisely what both Edmund Dudley and Henry VII, I think, were afraid of. Their grandchildren don't continue their line, and so they essentially both end for that reason. Robert Dudley dies in 1588, Ambrose dies in 1590, Elizabeth makes it to 1603, but essentially by that point, everyone knows that the Tudor dynasty is over. So I think absolutely there's a sense in which the Tudors use the Dudleys either as their sort of right-hand men and occasionally women, or they establish themselves by destroying a Dudley, by scapegoating one. And we see that pattern repeated throughout the 100 years that this book covers.
So let's go back to the beginning then, and Edmund. And there aren't that many people in history that get me riled up, because I'm perfectly capable of putting them, where they are 500 years ago. But by the middle of chapter 2, I was incensed by Edmund. In fact, I was listening to it on Audible in sort of the hour before I was going to sleep, and I had to listen much further on because I was so riled up by him I couldn't go to sleep. So let's let's talk about Edmund. And so you describe the methods. I mean, you've already mentioned there, when Henry VIII comes to the throne, the reason he can be so fabulous and flamboyant and do all the things he wants to do, which portray this majesty from the very beginning, is because Edmund Dudley has filled the coffers rather nicely. Let's talk about how he does that, how he's done that. Please explain to everyone watching his methods.
First of all, I mean, the Audible is fantastic, isn't it? The voice actor, I think it's Kristen Atherton, is amazing. So just a plug for her and for the audiobook. First of all, it's brilliant. It was such a joy for me to listen to it, and she put such emotion into it. So no wonder I think you struggle to sleep after it. It's so interesting because I didn't write anyone in this book as a hero or a villain. No. I just wrote sort of what was there, and I worked really hard at that because it is difficult sometimes. But you're not the first person to come up to me going, "Oh, that Edmund Dudley, I can't take him," because I guess the facts just speak for themselves. He did some unkind things, I guess is the best way to put it, without going into all the intricacies of the laws and the loopholes that he was exploiting, which can be very confusing and very boring to listen to. Essentially, what he was doing was taking already existing laws and using his own niche knowledge of them to exploit people and to get money out of them. So people, for instance, who might sign what was known as a bond for good behavior, essentially, for say £500, never thinking they'd ever have to pay up that money. Edmund would use his informers or promoters to find ways of accusing them of precisely that bad behavior to get that money, for instance. Or he would exploit technicalities in the king's prerogative, which meant that small, medieval, never been used laws, all of a sudden he was bringing forward and going, "See, you owe the king money." And people are going, "Well, come on." Nobody has used that in hundreds of years. But he was using that. And in some cases, it was noble families who had the money lying around. But in a lot of cases, it was tradespeople in London who were just trying to make a living, and he and his promoters or informers were hounding them to the edge of what they could handle, and often they ended up imprisoned. He raised a vast amount of money for the king. In under 4 years, he added 50% to the king's revenue, basically single-handedly within his account book. It's a huge amount of money, and it's coming from him choking essentially the people, particularly of London.
Well, now
you okay?
yeah. I'm getting annoyed. No, the story of the Sunifs I remember vividly. Now this is, and I suppose it is a good example, if you'd agree, of just the process and the lengths that he's willing to go to. So can you tell us briefly, if you like, the story of the Sunifs?
We have this story thanks to the work of Mark Horowitz, I should say, who did a fantastic article recovering from the archives this story. So I'm very much obligated to his work in my recounting of the story. And as you say, it's a perfect example of precisely how this would work. So one of Edmund Dudley's promoters or informers was a very unpleasant man named John Canby. And Canby heard a story of a baby being drowned in the Thames and connected this to the household of the Sunifs. Thomas Sunif, and I think her name is Alice, is the wife. Thomas Sunif was a haberdasher, meaning that he sold things associated with sewing, needles and thread and that sort of thing. And he had signed one of these bonds for good behavior for £500. And so Canby wants to accuse the Sunifs of the death of this baby to get that £500. He wasn't keeping the peace, he killed a baby, or his household, someone in his household killed a baby. So to get this £500, and obviously Edmund has made some sort of promise to the king that this £500 will be claimed for him. And so Canby captures, essentially, imprisons, kidnaps a maid in the household and sort of browbeats her into saying that she was responsible for it, and thus the Sunifs. She goes back and forth on her testimony various times, but Canby has essentially kidnapped and imprisoned her in his own house. Sunif is brought to Edmund Dudley at one point to try to plead his case. Dudley sends him off to be imprisoned in the Tower. Canby actually takes him to his house for a while. Sunif ends up imprisoned in 2 or 3 different jails across London and ends up in the Tower. He makes the deal to give £300 and more later, but that's insufficient, which is why he ends up in the Tower. Essentially, it's just this prolonged process of hounding this poor haberdasher for £500, and it destroys his livelihood. He's still in the Tower when, spoiler alert, Edmund Dudley ends up in there, and Edmund Dudley receives a plea from him, and sort of says, "Well, if I could help you, I could." But he knows that he did wrong in the case of Thomas Sunif. When he's in the Tower, he's very reflective on what he has done, as you would facing death. And trying to deal with some of that guilt, and he knows that he did wrong in the case of Thomas Sunif. That the report that he got was barely legitimate, and certainly couldn't support the case for the money, but was going with it anyway. And he blames it all on the king. That it was the king who wanted this money, and he was just following orders. But we don't know what happens to Sunif after all of this. Hopefully he's freed from the Tower and gets to go on and live his life. But £500 was a lot of money, and a year's work lost while he's imprisoned could destroy an entire family. So we just don't know what happens to them.
Oh, and didn't they take the opportunity to actually go in and just take all his stuff while he was in prison as well? So
yeah, they tried to recover the money through goods and property as well. So probably his livelihood was destroyed. And that's just one story. We have lists of people who for whom Edmund had decided they were going to produce money for the king, that he was going to squeeze money out of them. And we don't know in every case what the story exactly was. We're so lucky to have this one in a way. But for each one of those names, you can imagine a story like this.
Oh, see, the hackles on my back. Now, he picks on people, you've mentioned it briefly, but he picks on people from all sort of walks of life, presumably down to merchants or tradespeople, because they have some money to give over. But he goes right to the top and as far down as he can. Now, when Henry VII dies, it becomes quite clear, I think, that he was his only protection. So what happens once he loses that protection?
Yeah, Edmund Dudley does not appear to invest at all in making friends. He has 1 or 2 people who are sort of looking out for him, who help him get that position to begin with next to the king. But by the time Henry VII is falling ill and dies, most of those people have died. They were sort of an older generation, friends with Edmund Dudley's father, for instance. And so his only protection is the king himself. And once he's gone, Edmund Dudley is left exposed to his enemies, of which he has very, 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 very many, including in the court. Margaret Beaufort herself seems to have fallen on the wrong side of Edmund Dudley, or rather Edmund Dudley fell on the wrong side of Margaret Beaufort.
Not a good idea.
So not, you don't want to do that. So when Henry VII dies, there's essentially a meeting of the powerful members of the court, all of whom despise Edmund Dudley, and they decide that they're going to keep the king's death a secret for a few days while they smooth the path to the extension of Henry VIII. And as they're doing that, they're going to arrange for the arrest of Edmund Dudley. And so as the new reign is announced, Edmund Dudley is taken from his home in London and taken to the Tower.
So there's often this question around what happens next. Was he used as a scapegoat, as a way of Henry VIII gaining quick popularity, or did he deserve what he got? Or a bit of both?
Well, it depends on what you mean by deserve. Do we mean the sort of the
well, my feelings on the man,
scales of moral and poetic justice, or do we mean by the law? Edmund Dudley was accused of treason, of seeking to take the throne for himself, essentially, even accused of regicide or contemplating regicide. Certainly not. The evidence is sketchy at best. They use the fact that there's somewhat of an armory in his house to show that he was planning some sort of military overthrow. Anyone of any wealth had a bit of an armory going on, and if there was any intent with that armory, it was probably self-protection. We're not that far since the Wars of the Roses, and Edmund Dudley may have caught on to how unpopular he was, and so may have been stocking up for that reason. But they use that as proof that he was planning some sort of overthrow, which is just ridiculous. I mean, Edmund Dudley was not a military mind. He was a lawyer, and would not have been contemplating anything like that. So the treason charges were entirely false. Whether he deserved it in some sort of other moral sense, I mean, I can leave that to others to decide. You might think so. But certainly he was a victim of a court plot to do away with him. They knew that Henry VIII's reign would be tarnished in some way if it carried with it the unpopularity of the end of Henry VII's reign. They needed to wash away all of that and have this sort of clean, bright, golden start to the reign of Henry VIII. And it's important he's not executed right away. It takes a year, over a year, that he's imprisoned. And it seems to be that it's only when Henry VIII goes on his progress and realizes how unpopular Edmund Dudley and Richard Edson as well were across the country, and particularly in those areas that are more likely to riot and rebel, that he sends orders back to have him executed. So it does seem to be linked to the sense of scapegoating, of washing away those sort of sins of the father, to try to create a new start for this new reign.
Right. That's fascinating that although he picked on people in London, his reputation clearly had gone further.
It seems that way. I didn't pick up any straightforward evidence of that, but the circumstantial evidence is that Henry VIII goes on progress, and it's while he's on progress that he sends the orders out.
That's fascinating. So Edmund is deemed a traitor. He does eventually lose his head. But the Dudley family, so despite that label of traitordom, although I don't know if that's a word, I may have made that up, the family fortunes are restored under his son John. Now, is there a succinct-ish way of explaining how that happens?
I think there is, and it's the first instance we have, and there are many, of the women stepping in to essentially clean up the mess and to ensure the family's survival and position. So Edmund Dudley's mother was a woman named Elizabeth Grey Dudley, and about a year, just over a year after her husband's execution, she ends up married to the uncle of the king. Illegitimate uncle. He's an illegitimate son of Edward IV named Arthur Plantagenet, but he's very, very close to Henry. Henry VIII had partially raised him, and is part of his inner circle. And he marries John Dudley's mother. How exactly that happens, we're not that sure. I don't think she was just passive in it. Elizabeth Grey Dudley Plantagenet was related to Elizabeth Woodville, who of course makes a very fortuitous marriage to Edward IV himself. So this is a family with, I think, some awareness of how to play court politics. And so I think that marriage is really what ensures that John Dudley is restored, that he doesn't carry that stain of his father's treason. He's able to inherit lands. And he also ends up in the household of Edward Guildford, who is master of the armory for Henry VIII, and a very, very well-connected family. And so he ends up in their household as a ward, and essentially develops a father-son relationship with Edward Guildford, who ensures his education and puts him in positions where he can rise up through the court.
Because he proves himself in battle, doesn't he, as well? And the I mean, that's ultimate loyalty as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. He proves himself on the battlefields of France. 1523, he's in the army of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and Edward Guildford is there as well as master of the armory, and he's knighted there on the battlefields of France. And then returns back to England and participates in jousting and performance and all those sort of chivalrous pursuits that are so essential to the court of Henry VIII. And so it's through those means that he's able to climb up and really enter that world that his father had been essential to but peripheral to. John Dudley is in there in a big way.
We possibly should mention he was still quite young at the time that his father was executed, so maybe benefited from not having been, you can't be directly linked to his father in that way. He was still quite young.
He was 6 years old or 6 or 7, depending on exactly when he was born, when his father was executed. So absolutely, that the stain of treason is meant to follow through the generations, but these people understood. It was understood that obviously the 6-year-old had nothing to do with his father's treason, and so I think he's only 8 years old when he's restored, and there's this understanding that it's at this stage there's an understanding that it's not something he necessarily carries. It is thrown back in his face several times when he's older, and by the time you get to the third generation, there's this understanding where the treason and the Dudleys become almost synonymous.
So, I mean, anyone who's not sure who we're sort of why the name John Dudley is familiar, of course, we'll come back to it. But it's he was, of course, pivotal in trying to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and the overthrow there. But we'll come back to that in a little while. But one part of the story that I wanted to touch on is about John's sons. Now, we hear a lot about the Dudley brothers sort of once we get to 1553, yes, and the succession crisis. But so this was a surprise in your book, and there was John's eldest son, Henry, and this was we spoke earlier about people finding some of the book tear-jerking, and actually I wonder whether this is one of the stories that did it. Now he dies he dies much earlier than we start to usually hear about Dudley brothers. Can we just touch on Henry's story before we move on?
Absolutely. I had never encountered Henry Dudley either, but I think his story is very important to the story not only of John but of the brothers later on as well. So he's the first son born to John and his wife Jane Guildford, the daughter of his guardian. And he's named Henry, probably for the king. And he's educated with other young men of the court. The son of Henry Norris, also named Henry, is there, and they're educated by a French Protestant who's brought over by Anne Boleyn. So very much a part of that circle, and his participation in that circle is very important to John's connections to people like Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell. When he's 19, he travels with his father to France, to Boulogne, to the siege of Boulogne, just as John had traveled with his guardian, Edward Guildford, when he was a young man. Henry's 19, so just on the cusp of starting his own court career and rising up as John had done. Like his father, he's knighted in France following the battle, and he's described as this sort of paragon of young manliness. He's charming, he's athletic, he's good looking, he's also humble, and he's just taken to be this bright new future for the next generation of the Dudley family. Unfortunately, they stay in Boulogne after the battle. John is made governor of Boulogne. He's given the keys to the town by the king himself, and his son Henry stays with him. And following the battle, as you can imagine, especially after a prolonged siege, there's a lot of disease going around. There obviously had been many deaths in the battle. So there's corpses, there's what we now know to be all sorts of bacterias and everything else. And Henry appears to get what is known as the bloody flux, dysentery. And so he dies a very painful and inglorious death in Boulogne at the age of just 19. And John is there. He has to watch his son slip away from him in this really very horrible way. And without the rest of the family as well. So you can only imagine his mother, his younger brothers hearing about it and being unable to bury their son. It's a real tragedy, and I think for them would have put an end to those great dreams of Henry bringing the Dudley family into the sort of the glory of the next generation and the glory of the court.
It on a personal level and a dynastic level, then it's just an incredible tragedy.
Yeah.
So now you mentioned briefly there Cromwell. Now John benefits from sort of the patronage of Cromwell, their fellow sort of reformers. Now, of course, Cromwell doesn't do very well after the marriage with between Henry and Anne of Cleves. But so, what did the fall of Cromwell impact at all on John's sort of position at court? It may have done, but they managed to bounce back. So absolutely, John Dudley and Thomas Cromwell seem to work together quite a bit through the 1530s. We have a lot of letters between them, or a fair amount, for given how often these letters survive. And as you say, religion is very important to this as well. So the Dudleys are seen as part of that reformist group, brought in largely by Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell. And they are very important to the court around Anne of Cleves as well, that very, very brief moment in time when she's Queen of England.
Jane Dudley is a member of her household. John is her master of the horse. So Anne's arrival is meant to be, again, this great moment of sort of triumph and rise for the Dudley family. But of course, it doesn't end up working that way. And so when she falls, there is this sense that when she falls, well, when Cromwell falls, really, when Anne of Cleves is discarded and Cromwell falls, there is this sense in which the Dudleys may be on the out permanently, especially because her replacement is Catherine Howard, and the Howards and the Dudleys have this multi-generational beef against each other. They do not get along. The Howards are in many ways the great sort of antagonist to the Dudleys in my book, and historically that was the case. This old sort of noble, conservative, and religiously conservative family, seeing these upstart reformists like the Dudleys, there is this natural almost enmity between them. The sort of the benefit, the advantage for the Dudleys come in Catherine Howard's fall. The fact that she doesn't last very long either, and that she goes down in a very sort of spectacular way that condemns really her whole family as well. The Howards barely make it out of that one themselves, and John Dudley ends up playing this very important role in her fall. So when rumors start coming out about her sexual history, and Henry instructs investigations of her sexual past, Thomas Cranmer is sent in to essentially interrogate Catherine Howard, and we have this amazing report where he finds her in floods of tears. She's obviously, as you would be, anxious and stressed, and she's saying all sorts of things. At one point, she seems to admit to quite a bit. At one point, she suggests that she was forced into sexual relationships, which is, I think, something that has not been acknowledged enough in the way that we treat Catherine Howard. And all of this, Cranmer writes in a report, and he hands to the king. He hands it to John Dudley. It's possible, some historians say, that John Dudley was in the room during this interview, which of course would be, I think, very, very important for our understanding of the Dudley role in all of this, if he was in the room during that conversation. But either way, we know that he's handed the letter to deliver to the king, and that's one of the big sort of strikes against Catherine Howard, is what she admits to in this interview. And of course, handing the king bad news is a risky thing to do. It really could have gone either way, but obviously it secures the Dudley survival through all of this that's going on in the early 1540s. And John Dudley is actually given the role of taking the king's daughter, the Lady Mary, out of the court, and to the residence of the young Prince Edward. And so he's given an important role in sort of cleaning up after Catherine Howard, which is part of why they continue to rise at the end of the reign of Henry VIII. The other big reason is Henry VIII's final wife, Catherine Parr, and the fact that she has a very, very close relationship with Jane Dudley, John Dudley's wife. And again, that sort of the women coming in and picking up the pieces. We see that again at the end of the reign of Henry VIII.
Fascinating. Yes, these friendships, I suppose, especially female friendships, are not necessarily going to be documented, because why? Like, under what circumstance would they be? And yet they're pivotal in shaping things that are happening. I find that bit really fascinating. So it could have gone either way for John Dudley at that point. Literally, if it was shoot the messenger, that could have been it. Did I understand right that he not only had the letter, the sort of account from Cranmer, but that there were bits in it that he had to, extra bits he had to verbalise it? It wasn't all actually in the document.
Absolutely. The document itself says that this messenger, John Dudley, paraphrasing, will tell you more about this. So either, again, he had been told things to pass on verbally that Cranmer didn't want to commit to paper, unfortunately, very annoyingly, as a historian, or he was in the room. This is evidence that he was in the room and therefore able to say directly what had happened. And so who knows what that extra message was? Who knows whether it was just observation of what was happening in the room, whether there was some even more scandalous admission. But John Dudley had that information and unfortunately never wrote it down for us. But he was so pivotal to that moment.
A real turn pin moment, potentially. So obviously, then he survives the breakdown of the Howard marriage, outlives King Henry VIII. Now, in your book, you've got that portrait, and forgive me, I can't remember who painted it or who it's attributed to. With pardon, that's it. Yes, so Henry's in his sick bed, helpfully pointing directly to Edward. So this is probably quite familiar to people. So you've got the Pope getting crushed underneath there because we're not going to have that back. But then you've got the men sitting to Edward's left, our right, as you look at the picture. Now, the first one is the stood one, Edward Seymour, am I right?
Yes, that's almost certainly Edward Seymour, who becomes Lord Protector.
And the second one, though?
That's almost certainly John Dudley. So
can you explain to everyone, what's the role then that John is taking on in the reign of Edward VI now?
As I said, the Dudleys are doing quite well at the end of the reign of Henry VIII. Largely that's to do with the relationship between Jane and Catherine Parr, but also to do with the relationship between John and Edward Seymour. Edward Seymour had been there on the battlefields of France in 1523. He too had been knighted, and it seems to be the case that from that point onward, John and Edward Seymour become very, very close friends. We see them working together quite a bit, property deals, that sort of thing. But also it's the case that whenever Edward Seymour vacates a position for a higher one in the court, he sort of levels up. John Dudley takes the position he's just vacated. And at least in one case, we have the letter where Edward Seymour says, John Dudley would be great for this. He's fantastic. Why don't you give him the role? Which is why John Dudley ends up in the position of Lord Admiral, and he does fantastic things as Lord Admiral. It's because Seymour has just moved on. So there's obviously a very close connection between these two. And that's very, very important because Edward Seymour is the uncle to the heir to the throne. His sister had been Jane Seymour, who gives birth to Edward, who becomes Edward VI. And so when Edward VI comes to the throne, Edward Seymour heads up the council, this regency council that is governing, because Edward VI is too young to govern on his own. And very quickly he becomes Lord Protector, king in all but name, essentially. And John Dudley is his very, very close friend. And we see ambassadors talking about them as a political unit, as in the same sentence as controlling what is happening in the court. So they're obviously working together quite a bit, which is why it's almost certainly John Dudley is going to be sat next to Edward Seymour in a portrait like that. He's sort of his right hand man. And I have to say, if any of you caught Becoming Elizabeth, that is something that I thought this Stars TV show that's just been on, that was one thing I thought they did really, really well, was to show this connection and this working relationship between Edward Seymour and John Dudley. I don't think I've ever seen that portrayed on screen before. And it's exactly the case that's how things worked.
That's an interesting point anyway, actually. I'm thinking about generally dramatizations. You see political alliances, you see, transactional relationships where, you don't see the friendships, the actual genuine, he's sort of my kin. I've been with him since the battlefield, and therefore, that's very interesting.
And they absolutely operated like brothers, to the point where under the reign of Edward VI, they have their children marry each other, right? John's eldest son, annoyingly the name John, marries Edward's daughter Anne. And it's definitely not a love match. She's only 12. So it is this sort of dynastic alliance, and it's cementing, I think, a real genuine affection that existed between the two men. Though I will say it may not have still existed at the point that the actual marriage took place. By then, things were starting to break down.
Right. Okay. Oh, so much we could go into today, isn't there?
Yes.
So now, we're going to have to skip a little bit forward then, because I'm thinking about now getting to Edward's rather premature death. Now, he gets ill, and he's ill long enough to write his own device for the succession, which he sees as trumping his father's, Henry VIII's will. Now, he writes this, but then we see him create alterations, the more obvious that he's going to get. There we go. And this is in his own hand, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is absolutely in Edward VI's own hand. You won't be able to see it very clearly. You can find it online if you look up device for the succession. But what you can probably see there, or if you buy the book.
If you buy the book.
You can see he's crossed some things out. There are additions. It's all a bit messy because it's been changed.
Yeah. So he's getting to the point where he's realizing, actually, this isn't something I'm going to recover from now. And he changes. So he makes these changes. Now, this is like one of those questions, again, that comes up about John. Or some people just state it as they know what happened. But how much of a hand did John Dudley have in Edward's succession plan?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a good question. we don't know. I think that is the sort of the $1 million question. It has often been assumed, I think, and sort of dramatically portrayed, that John Dudley, by now Duke of Northumberland, he has overthrown his old friend Edward Seymour. He's not become Lord Protector, but he's become Lord President of the Council. So he is sort of running things. That he's standing over the sick Edward VI and either forcing him to write this, or even holding his hand, or whatever it might be. That he really is the secret author behind it. That has often been assumed because the device for the succession is very much in his favor. The device for the succession skips over the claims of the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth, who become, of course, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and instead hands the throne to their cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who in May 1553 becomes Lady Jane Dudley, because she marries one of the sons of John Dudley. So it essentially is a document that ensures that John Dudley's son becomes, at the very least, king consort, and that a new Dudley dynasty begins. So he's often assumed to have quite a lot to do with that. The problem is we don't really know the timings around when it's first written and when it's revised. The revisions are what hands the crown directly to Jane Grey, Jane Dudley. And so we don't know where it sits in terms of when the marriage takes place. So when it would have been known that she would have been married to Guildford Dudley, and all of these sort of complexities. And we have no record that would tell us exactly what role John Dudley would have played. What we do know, though, is that the device for the succession was not contrary to anything that Edward VI believed either. We also know that he was nearing the age of 16. He definitely knew his own mind. He kept a journal. We know we have several letters from him. He was somebody who felt very strongly about things, and was aware of his own power and his own right as a king. We know that he was strongly what we would call Protestant, as was Jane Grey. And we know that he was very concerned about the throne going to, he didn't want it go to a woman. Now you think, okay, well, Jane Grey is a woman, so what's he doing? But the device said that it would go to the heirs male of Jane Grey. So it would skip over the two half sisters, would skip over Jane and her mother, and would go to Jane's heir male, because he wanted a male on the throne, even if it was a squalling baby. And that's because Jane was the only one who was about to be married or was married, and thus could already be pregnant. Mary and Elizabeth were not even close to being married, and it was very difficult to marry them off for all sorts of reasons. And so it seems to be this combination of the fact that Jane Grey was definitely a Protestant, whereas Mary was definitely a Catholic. Elizabeth was a little ambiguous, but also that Jane was either married or about to be married, and thus could produce an heir. That I think sits behind the device for the succession, and is entirely in line with what we know about Edward. So John doesn't need to have influenced it. He may have done, we don't know, but he isn't necessary to producing it.
I think that's such an important point, because it gives the account that John Dudley sort of forces him to do anything, gives Edward no agency, and yet we know that he had strong opinions.
Yeah.
It would have been an interesting reign to have if he'd have continued.
Yeah.
But now, it was only actually though in reading your book that that I've ever heard it from sort of Dudley's point of view, and how, you know, it felt to me like they could have they saw the genuine merits behind this succession, this succession plan. How likely, I suppose, from their point of view, would it have been that Edward's plan would have succeeded, or equally not succeeded? You know, did they even think there was any risk in it not being seen through?
We know so well Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, and the fact that it ends, and it ends very quickly, and it ends almost very easily. That Mary the First, Lady Mary, who becomes Mary the First, easily takes the throne back, and I think it's almost seen as this sort of silly thing. Why would they have this queen who obviously isn't legitimate, you know, isn't the legitimate heir, and you know, what is she doing here? But that's all, I think, with hindsight. And absolutely at the time, even Mary's closest supporters were saying she's got two options: she can flee to the continent or give herself over. There's no way she can stand against the military might that is John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. I mean, by this point, he had established such an impressive military career that there's no way that she could have gone to battle against him and won. And there was no other way of taking the throne back, it was assumed. And so even her supporters are going, well, you know, this is going to be a very successful coup, clearly, because Mary's got nothing she can do against the Dudleys, and it's got the whole support of the council behind them as well. Nobody deviated. They all signed on to the new Queen Jane. It was going. It all falls apart, of course, for I guess sort of two main reasons. One, the Lady Mary is incredibly popular and incredibly wealthy. She is a huge landowner in her own right. There's been some fantastic work done recently to demonstrate that, and she is very popular. I think there's some residuals resentment for what happened to her mother and to her, and the sense in which there's a justice involved in making sure that she comes to the throne. The other is in many ways the unpopularity of John Dudley. And so he's the one who sent out against the Lady Mary. In some ways that makes sense. He is the foremost military commander in England at the time. But while he's gone, the council shifts. They change. They change their allegiance from Queen Jane to Queen Mary. And there is a sense amongst some, particularly those involved with the Howard family, again, there's a sense of glee in the arrest, I think, of John Dudley. So there is no battle. It doesn't break out into civil war, which it very much could have done, because the council shifts and people start leaving John Dudley's army. They don't believe in the cause of fighting for Queen Jane, and so he just surrenders, and is brought back to London and imprisoned in the Tower.
Now let's get on to Robert, because this is the first time we see him taking an active role. Explain to people what his role was in all these goings on, because he of course lands in the Tower as well.
Yeah, all of the sons, there's 5 of them at this point, end up imprisoned in the Tower together. Robert has his own sort of, I almost want to describe it as a side quest. He has his own specific part to play in this, because he's sent essentially in another direction to capture the Lady Mary very, very early on. So as soon as Queen Jane comes to the throne, Robert is sent off to capture Queen Mary, at this point, the Lady Mary, who becomes Queen Mary. And but Mary is one step ahead of them the whole time. She knows what's happening before it happens. She knows where people are going, and so she's able to stay away from Robert Dudley and the small force he has with him, sent to capture her. So he's tried separately for treason, but he is still imprisoned with his brothers. And as you say, this is the first moment we really see Robert Dudley acting in the historical record on his own. It wasn't his first military experience, though. He had been with his father in putting down rebels, so he's already been on the field, which is probably why he's tasked with doing this independently.
And he wasn't that old, was he?
No, so he was born in probably 1530. Oh, you're going to catch me here. 32. So he's 20, 21.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So still very much a young man. Yeah,
but yeah, still young man. So John Dudley and his sons all end up in the Tower. What happens next?
Very, very quickly, John Dudley is tried for treason. Unlike his father's treason trial, which was essentially a farce, it was entirely fabricated accusations. John Dudley did exactly what he's accused. He supported Queen Jane, took up arms against Queen Mary. But there's this really interesting question that John Dudley himself articulates in his own trial, which is, even though he did exactly those things, was it treason? Because he was acting under the orders of the Queen at the time, with the approval of the councils, and some of the members of the council are there judging him, right? They were surely complicit. How can they pass a verdict on him when he was doing exactly what they told him to do? And he had letters and the seal, and he's operating entirely officially. So how was it treason? And he articulates this in his trial, and they technicalities, and they sort of say, well, we're not accused of treason, you are, and well, she was a usurper, so her seal was no good, so you were obviously raising arms against the true monarch. So the fact that the regime change means the whole landscape shifts underneath him means that it's a done deal from the start, and he probably would have known that. What's really interesting is right before his execution, in fact his execution is postponed to allow for it, he converts. So he converts to the Catholic religion, to the religion of the new queen. And this is often taken as a sign of his religious instrumentalism, his lack of integrity, that there's this sort of last ditch attempt to save his life, and in so doing he throws away everything he believes in. I mean, I think that's one interpretation. I'm more convinced that he would have known either way he was doomed, and he's thinking of his 5 sons imprisoned in the Tower. I can't imagine he thought that this scaffold conversion would actually save his life. I think he was trying to save the lives of his sons by doing this, and so that sheds a very different light on it. He's executed nonetheless the next day, as I think he would have expected to be leaving the five sons still imprisoned in the Tower.
What last thoughts he must have had must have been, incredibly frightening for them. So we're now on to our third generation of Dudleys, and currently they're all in the Tower. So and they've got yet again to overcome this stain of tracery. Of course, we know Guildford Dudley, of course, gets executed, but what about the other brothers? What happens to them?
Well, here come the women again to tidy things up and save the family. So the mother, Jane Dudley, Duchess of Northumberland, immediately sort of swings into action. She's trying to get to the Queen. She rides out to try to meet with her, is turned away. She writes letters to those around the Queen to try to save first her husband and then her sons. The wives of the sons are instrumental in petitioning to have their husbands released. The eldest sister, Mary Dudley, who by then is Mary Sidney, is very important in this as well, and particularly her husband, Henry Sidney. He is part of the entourage who is sent to Philip II of Spain to negotiate his marriage to Mary I. And Philip II of Spain is hugely important to the recovery and restoration of the Dudley family, because essentially, and what we suspect Henry Sidney must have said to Philip II at this stage was, "You're going to need friends in the English court. Most people don't like you." There was an entire rebellion that took place against this marriage. That's what leads to the death of Guildford Dudley. You're going to need friends in the court. There's this whole room full of Dudley brothers who are ready to support you if you help them be pardoned and released. And that's clearly a strategy, particularly on the part of the Dudley women, is to appeal to Philip II. And Robert Dudley later says that Philip II was his savior, that he owes Philip II his life. So obviously this works. And Jane Dudley, Duchess of Northumberland, on her deathbed, writing her final will, is giving gifts to Spanish courtiers, trying to remind them of their promises to take care of her children. So in early 1555, the three remaining Dudley brothers, the eldest, John, had died. He became ill while imprisoned in the Tower. Guildford, of course, is executed. But the three remaining, who are Ambrose, Robert, and annoyingly another Henry, who we'll call Harry, are released, thanks to the efforts, and we know it's thanks to the efforts of the women of the Dudley family. They immediately follow through on their promise to Philip II. They're participating in jousts to sort of show that Philip II is participating in English traditions around the joust, and they accompany the English army to France to support Philip II's army there. And so once again, we find some Dudleys on the battlefields of France, and this is where we lose the youngest Dudley brother, Henry or Harry. So we lose a second Henry Dudley in France, supporting the army of Philip II, and only two Dudley brothers return. Out of 8 sons born, it's down to 2, and that's just Ambrose and Robert.
Wow. Yeah. Now, let's get on to Robert then, because he's probably the most famous of the Dudleys, due to him being a quote unquote a favourite of Elizabeth I. Now, we know he proposed. We know he had, he definitely wanted to marry her for whatever, I suppose, reasons people like to interpret it differently. But where do you stand? Do you think he loved her, Elizabeth? Do you think he loved him?
Yeah, I mean, pulling emotions out of historical records can be a very complicated thing to do. However, I think we can definitely say from the sources is that there was a deep, long-lasting affection between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I. And at various points, they at least suggested that a marriage was possible, and that he was being lined up throughout her reign as a favorite, as a powerful partner to her reign. However, that was going to be sort of cemented. We know that this affection existed for all sorts of reasons. I mean, their letters to each other are beautiful. Her nickname for him was Eyes, my eyes, and in the letters, he often uses that almost as we'd use a little emoji. If he has two O's in a word, he'll put little eyebrows over them.
There's nothing new on the planet, is there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Robert Dudley was using emojis before it was cool. And he'll use the symbols. He'll say sort of "forever your," and then draw little eyes. So it's very cute, and he does that in his last letter to her, which she then keeps by her bedside until her own death, and writes in her own hand his last letter. So clearly there is something between them. What exactly that was, we can only read into it so far.
So just as a little bit of an aside, but what do you think he felt then when she put forward this idea that he should marry Mary, Queen of Scots?
Yeah, it's such an interesting moment in time, in the early 1560s, where there is a suggestion that Robert Dudley might marry Mary, Queen of Scots. I can't tell if anyone really took this seriously, because what we have is both queens and certain commentators, ambassadors and the like, thinking it's kind of hilarious. Mary herself says at one point to the English ambassador that she thinks it's I think I'm paraphrasing. She thinks it's a great idea because then Elizabeth and her can each have one. She doesn't really want Robert because obviously there's this connection between them, and she doesn't really want Ambrose because he's not as good looking as Robert. If he were, then she'd take him, and it would be a perfect setup. So there's I don't know how seriously either one of them took it. And we don't know how he felt about it. What's quite interesting, though, is that we do know he was very invested in creating a relationship between Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots. He's the one who tries to put together a meeting between them in, I think it's the early 1560s, at York. He puts a lot into this, and Elizabeth sort of pulls out at the last minute for various reasons. And he's also late in the reign writing to Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James, who of course becomes James I of England, as well as James VI of Scotland, and trying to sort of facilitate that relationship and James as the new heir. So he's very interested in Scotland and bringing together Scotland and England, thinking forward and to the end of the reign. We also know, just as one more point on this, that for whatever reason he has, I think it's in Leicester House, his London house, he has that famous drawing, sort of map of the death of Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, Lord Darnley, which if you Google you can see why he has that. So I think he's sort of like, ooh, dodged a bullet with that one. But for whatever reason, he has this in his home. So clearly it's something he's at least still thinking about.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Also, now, so let's talk about Robert a little bit away from his relationship with Elizabeth, because it's interesting actually that I always think women get put in as a side note to the men, but let's be fair, when the women are in power, that can also happen to the men. So let's talk about Robert a little bit. Now, when I came to see you in the beautiful St Mary's Church, we weren't that far away from a building called Lord Leicester Hospital, which I know you managed to go to as well. You probably have gone to it, but I saw the photographs of you there.
Yes.
Can we just, I know it's a little bit of an aside, but can we talk about the Lord Leicester Hospital, why he established it, and what it was for? Because I think this speaks to Robert as a person.
Absolutely. Lord Leicester Hospital is in Warwick. If anyone gets the chance, it's closed for refurbishment at the moment, but when it reopens, I've seen the plans. I've walked around some of the work that they're doing there. It's going to be spectacular. It's going to be a really, really wonderful exhibition. So do keep an eye out for when it reopens, and do plan a visit there. It is established by Robert Dudley, who's by then Earl of Leicester, in 1571 as a sort of almshouse. A hospital to us, we think of, A&E and operations and everything else. Hospital at the time meant more of a sort of charity house. If we think about hospitals, hospitality, it is this place where people can find hospitality where they might not otherwise. And it's particularly for injured soldiers and their wives. And they become the brethren, and it lasts till today. There are still brethren of Lord Leicester's Hospital. So this thing that he established in 1571 continues today, which is really, I think, a fantastic testament to what he had planned on doing, and this charity that he set up. Obviously, soldiers came back from wars in the Elizabethan period, injured, destitute. There wasn't a lot of money in soldiering, and there was no infrastructure to support them as there might be now. And so he established this as one way of supporting these men and their entire families. He may have been inspired to do so, I would sort of posit, by his own brother. His brother Ambrose comes back from war in France in 1563, I believe it is, heavily injured. He ends up probably lame for the rest of his life, and may even towards the end of his life have had his leg amputated. And obviously there is lots of support for Ambrose, because they're quite well moneyed and can take care of him. But it may have triggered something in Robert to think about those who are not so fortunate, or even Ambrose may have made the argument that this is something that should be set up, because Ambrose had very close relationships with the men that he served with in France. So it comes out of that sort of environment. And yeah, it's still there today. You can go and see it.
Mm. I'm very lucky, actually. I'm going to get to go and have a look this afternoon. So maybe do a little bit of a video. So if I've mentioned it, I will put a link from this interview to the hospital. And like you say, but it will be open again next summer. So for everyone to go and see, and yes, should be on everyone's itinerary, I think.
Yeah.
So another thing that I think we should mention, because this sort of wraps up what the end of the two dynasties, as we sort of mentioned at the beginning. Now, in the Beauchamp Chapel, I mentioned already Robert's tomb. He's next to Lettice Knowles, and of course his brother Ambrose is in there. But of course there's another tomb in there, the tomb of the son of Robert and Lettice, another Robert, the noble imp. And their son predeceases them, which must have been incredibly painful, and they don't conceive again. So Robert knows that his line is going to die out with him. Now, in the book, you describe sort of that sadness, I think, that Robert feels about having no heir. Now, would it be fair to say there's some lamentation on his part for his lifelong commitment to the Queen, and that sort of leaving him in this position? Would that be fair to say?
I think by sort of the mid 1570s, so particularly around the time of the great Kenilworth celebrations of 1575, which is often seen as this last very expensive to attempt to persuade the Queen to marry him. I don't know if that's necessarily what it is, but certainly after that, Robert seems to, well, he does in fact marry not that long after, and so obviously something changes, because right before Kenilworth, he writes this fascinating letter to his lover, a woman named Douglas Sheffield, and she's obviously put pressure on him to marry her. Fair enough. And he's resisting, and he says, and actually maybe I'll read it directly because I think it's a really telling quote. He says, "Is there nothing in the world next to that favour with the Queen that I would not give to be in hope of leaving some children behind me, being now the last of our house?" So clearly it's very passionate. He is desperate to have children, and legitimate children, but that's next to the favour of the Queen. Is there nothing I would give next to that favour? So obviously he's not willing to give up the favour of the Queen to have children at that point. A few years later, he is. I think that's a combination of it being clear that the Queen is never going to marry him. He does have a child with Douglas Sheffield, and that child is a boy. So the fact he then is aware that he can have children. He didn't have any children with his first wife. So he may have not thought it was possible. Now he's had a child, he's had a son, he knows that he could have children. And so I think all of that changes. And so he does marry Lettice Knowles, and that's his only chance to have children. And the fact that he does have a son, they're obviously ecstatic about it, but then that child dies at about the age of 3. And there's a letter in which someone is offering their condolences to Robert and saying, well, you might have more children, it'll be okay. And you can almost feel from the letter, not only that Robert thinks that's pretty cold consolation when I've lost my son, but he writes in it that he doesn't think they'll have any more children as he's now advanced in age. And obviously that's not a problem for a man. It must be Lettice, but he's talking about it as they are a unit in that, which I think is, I didn't expect to see that coming from the 16th century, that he's going to stick with her even if she can't have more children. And he sees that as him not being able to have more children as well. There's something really beautiful in that. Yeah,
definitely. Now, before we wrap up the main part of the interview and move on to the questions from the patrons, I just have one last thing now. Your use of descriptive language, and we've talked about as well on the Audible, the beautiful sort of performance of it, if that's the right term to use, is really brings your words to life. Now I'm going to read just one short passage and then ask you my question. So it's the start of chapter 4. Sparks erupted on the surface of the ornate polished plate as metal struck metal. The tiny fires reflected on the smooth blade of the massive two-handed sword before vanishing into the air almost as quickly as they'd appeared. The two men grunted as they heaved their swords up to strike again, and so on and so forth. Now, with that level of beautifully descriptive language, can we maybe expect a fiction book from you at some point?
Oh, I mean, not in the very near future. It's very kind of you. I definitely wrote this with fiction techniques in mind. This is a non-fiction book written as close to fiction as possible without not making it without losing that non-fiction qualifier. I'm almost proud of the fact that in one of my Amazon reviews, which I don't normally read, but I read this one, they were so convinced by my writing style that they were convinced I'd made things up, which I haven't. Nothing is made up in this book at all. But yeah, I'll take that as a compliment, I guess. I am not currently planning a fiction book. There has been talk with my editor about that, and I will think about it. But the next book will also be nonfiction.
But it's beautifully written, and I think the way you've done it though really has, it's done something slightly different, and it has brought it to life. It's really amusing that people think that it could be fiction when The usual issue is that the fiction they think is non-fiction. But
Yeah.
well, that's wonderful. So before we move on to the questions from my patrons and leave the main interview, let's let everyone else know where they can find you online. Anything basically you want to share about what you're up to.
Absolutely. I have a website, joannepaul.com, nice and easy. If anyone else is still on Twitter, I'm still on Twitter, which is at Joanne_Paul_. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Joanne Paul. I'm on Mastodon. I don't even know how to read that out, but you can probably, if you work hard enough, you can find me on Mastodon. And so it'd be lovely if people keep in touch. I have a newsletter as well that I've just set up. You can sign up for that on my website. It'll be monthly mail outs with interviews and updates, and there's a sort of book of the month book club as well, as every once in a while I'll send out some deals and things like that, and special announcements that everyone on the mailing list will get slightly before everyone on social media. So you can sign up for that on my website.
That sounds brilliant. I'll pop all the links to those in the show notes as well, so that it's easy for people to find you.
I think what helps them get back into favor is the women. And they do this fantastic job of sort of shoring up the family and ensuring its survival and continuance. I had no idea when I started working on this that the women played such an important role.